Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to jump straight into one of the most fascinating geopolitical puzzles out there right now, the shadow network of the global oil trade. We're constantly hearing about economic sanctions on the news, right? We hear about these massive trade restrictions and embargoes that are specifically designed to stop the flow of resources from certain countries. But when you actually look closely at the data, a much, much more complex picture emerges. And honestly, this matters deeply to all of us. This hidden flow of energy directly impacts the price of gas at our local pumps and the inflation rates shaping our everyday economy. So, tracing this hidden oil isn't just some academic exercise. It's about understanding the unseen forces that are dictating global wealth. We're going to break down exactly how massive amounts of oil are still making their way across the globe, completely bypassing standard international checkpoints. So, here's the billion-dollar question. If sanctions completely shut down the main roads, how are millions of barrels of oil still moving around? Our sources point out a crucial reality check right off the bat, and it comes with a staggering statistic. Some estimates suggest roughly 1 in 5 barrels of oil globally might be moving through these exact shadow networks. Think about that for a second. 1 in 5. That is a massive volume of global energy. Now, it's not that sanctions do nothing. When major sanctions hit, traditional visible oil flows absolutely do reduce. The tap doesn't just stay wide open in broad daylight. But the trade doesn't disappear, it simply adapts. The participants essentially take their business off the grid. They abandon the brightly lit main highways of global commerce and find the back roads. All right, let's dive into this. How exactly do you take a massive, lumbering oil tanker off the grid? The answer is ghost fleets. These are essentially untracked oil tankers that operate completely outside standard maritime surveillance. To use a super simple analogy, imagine cars driving down a busy highway at midnight, but with their headlights completely turned off and using fake license plates. That's what's happening on the ocean. In the maritime world, ships use automatic identification systems, or AIS. These transponders constantly broadcast a ship's location, its identity, and its destination. Well, ghost fleet vessels routinely just turn these tracking systems off. And I have to stress, this is a deliberate and massive risk. You basically become a colossal steel beast navigating pitch-black oceans, totally blind to other ships, risking terrible collisions. But by doing this, they literally vanish from the digital maps that global watchdogs use to monitor trade. It allows them to load, transport, and unload cargo practically invisible to standard algorithms. Now, this global workaround isn't just a single hidden tunnel. It's a robust, highly decentralized network of clever adaptation methods. Ghost fleets are really just one tool in a very deep toolkit. Take ship-to-ship transfers, for instance. Imagine 2 massive steel leviathans meeting in the middle of a turbulent ocean, completely far away from any port authority. They toss these thick hoses across the open water to literally pump millions of gallons of crude from one ship to another. It is incredibly dangerous and requires immense nautical skill, and it's all done just to confuse the paper trail. Then we have blended crude, which we'll expand on in just a second. And finally, there's indirect routing, taking massive, wildly expensive geographical detours to entirely avoid areas with heavy naval surveillance. It's just a highly adaptable, multi-layered system of evasion. Let's zoom in on one of those specific methods: blended crude. This is a remarkably simple but incredibly effective way to completely hide the origin of the oil. Think of it like pouring generic store-bought cola into a classic Coca-Cola bottle, or maybe mixing 3 different brands of soda together in a giant pitcher. Once those liquids are mixed up, it becomes chemically and practically impossible for an inspector to extract a sample and definitively prove exactly where every single drop came from. And get this doesn't usually happen in a standard, easily monitored port. It often occurs in massive floating storage facilities anchored offshore. They're basically giant ocean-bound bathtubs. By mixing sanctioned oil with non-sanctioned oil out at sea, the restricted commodity is washed clean and given a brand new, perfectly legal identity. So where is the absolute ideal geographical loophole to pull off this kind of off-the-grid activity? Our sources highlight a secret escape route known as the Quiet Path, the Caspian Sea. It is the world's largest inland body of water. To put its sheer size into perspective, the Caspian is roughly the size of Japan or the state of Montana. It is a vast expanse of water, completely bordered by Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan. Because it's completely landlocked, it is entirely isolated from the open oceans. And that geographical reality is exactly what makes it the absolute perfect quiet path for countries looking to completely avoid the gaze of global watchdogs. This brilliantly illustrates the contrast between these two worlds.
On one side, you have the Strait of Hormuz. That is the traditional public highway of the global oil trade. It's a massive global choke point that is heavily monitored by Western naval surveillance. Every ship going through there is watched, logged, and heavily scrutinized. Now compare that to the Caspian Sea. The Caspian is essentially a private backyard pool. It operates under strict inland regional control, and most importantly, there is absolutely zero Western naval pressure there. Why? Because you physically cannot sail a US or European warship into it. The sea is landlocked, and access via any connecting rivers is governed by strict regional treaties controlled by the bordering nations. It is a completely closed ecosystem, acting as the ultimate geopolitical safe haven.
Okay, so how does this Caspian route actually function in practice? Let's walk through the exact choreography of this workaround step by step. Step 1. Iran moves its oil north to the Caspian Sea, utilizing either their domestic pipelines or smaller regional ships. Step 2. Russia receives that oil. Because Russia has massive refining and export infrastructure right there on its Caspian coast, they can facilitate seamless oil swaps. Step 3 is where the magic happens, the blending and relabeling. Connecting back to our earlier analogy, this is where that giant offshore pitcher of generic and brand name soda is aggressively mixed together, effectively scrubbing the oil's original DNA. And finally, Step 4. That newly relabeled clean oil is re-exported to global markets, specifically to major buyers like China and India, completely untethered from its sanctioned origins. But here's the thing. Moving the physical liquid? That's really only half the battle. This shadow economy moves billions of dollars a day. If you are operating under heavy international sanctions, you are almost certainly locked out of the US dollar and the standard global banking system, like SWIFT. So we have to follow the money. Dodging the dollar becomes just as important as dodging naval ships. How on earth do these nations safely settle accounts for billions of dollars in daily oil trades when they can't even use traditional bank wires? Well, to pull this off, these nations utilize a really massive variety of non-dollar payment channels. A significant portion of this strategy involves leaning heavily into the Chinese yuan. By trading in yuan, they just entirely bypass the US financial system. There's also a major return to old-school economics with barter deals. And we aren't talking about small local trades here. We're talking about exchanging millions of barrels of crude oil directly for cargo ships full of tea, specialized manufactured goods, or highly specific tech components, without a single cent of currency ever changing hands. On top of all that, they're aggressively building entirely alternative, parallel financial messaging systems to replace SWIFT entirely. Now, I want to pause here for a totally fascinating reality check straight from our source material. Because this trade happens off the grid, a lot of people naturally assume that all this illicit oil is being fueled by Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. It makes sense, right? But the truth is, crypto is actually much less dominant in this massive state-level trade than commonly assumed. Why? Because cryptocurrency is simply too volatile for sovereign nations executing billions of dollars in physical commodity trades. Imagine trying to price a million-barrel oil shipment when the currency's value might literally fluctuate by 10% in a single afternoon. State actors require stability. They vastly prefer stable currencies like the renminbi or hard physical assets. At this point, you might be wondering about the masterminds behind all of this. Setting up ghost fleets, orchestrating open ocean transfers, building alternative financial infrastructure. Just imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of coordinating even one of these hidden trades. You have to find the untracked ships, bribe the right port officials, secure non-dollar payments, and risk millions in cargo out on the pitch-black open sea. It requires immense effort and staggering risk. So why go through all this trouble? Let's pull back the curtain and look at the underlying strategic motives that actually drive this massive operation. When we break down the motives by country, we see a highly calculated benefit for every single player in the supply chain. For Iran, the motive is fundamental survival. This network keeps critical revenue flowing into their economy and allows them to bypass that heavy surveillance in the Strait of Hormuz. For Russia, acting as the middleman gives them immense pricing leverage and helps them build a stronger, self-sustaining anti-Western economic bloc. And for the end buyers like China and India, it comes down to simple economics. They secure reliable access to massively discounted crude oil. And that massive discount really matters. It directly suppresses inflation in their domestic economies and heavily fuels their manufacturing dominance on the global stage. For them, it is a calculated win-win-win. Which brings us to a major overarching question regarding global geopolitics. When we step back and look at this complex Caspian nexus, the ghost fleets, the yuan payments, the shared coastal infrastructure, is this a tightly coordinated, secret, villainous alliance controlling everything from a smoke-filled room? Or is it actually just a coincidence? Are these simply separate nations finding the exact same life rafts in order to survive the current geopolitical storm? The crucial point is summarized so perfectly by our sources. They describe this phenomenon beautifully as parallel survival strategies gradually aligning. So it's not necessarily a mastermind conspiracy where everyone is taking daily orders from a single boss. Rather, sheer necessity is the mother of invention here. Because these different nations are facing similar external pressures and similar economic sanctions, they naturally develop the exact same workarounds. Over time, those totally separate survival strategies bump into each other, overlap, and gradually align into the cohesive shadow trade network we're seeing today. And that leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. The entire modern framework of global economic control relies heavily on two twin pillars: the dominance of the US dollar and Western naval supremacy. As these alternative networks, these ghost fleets, these inland seas, these non-dollar payment systems, as they grow stronger, more efficient, and more entrenched, what happens to that traditional control? If sanctions can be reliably bypassed through parallel systems, how will the world's major powers actually enforce international law in the future? It's a massive, massive shift in the global energy market, and one we are absolutely going to be watching closely. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.